Ever wonder what films raked in stacks of cash when your grandparents were dating? Forget Marvel. Hollywood's golden age created the blockbuster template we still follow today. These money-printing masterpieces didn't just dominate box offices, they literally saved struggling studios from bankruptcy overnight. Audiences flocked to these spectacles in numbers that would make modern studio executives weep with envy, ready to discover the films that made more money than God in cinema's golden era. Let's dive into these forgotten box office behemoths. 1. Gone with the Wind, 1939. Talk about a film that refused to be forgotten. Gone with the Wind stormed theaters with hurricane force in 1939, raking in an earth-shattering $390 million during its original run. That's over $3.7 billion in today's money. Producer David O. Selznick mortgaged everything he owned to finance this risky Civil War epic that MGM thought would crash and burn. The 4-hour runtime had executives convinced audiences would revolt before the intermission. The casting search for Scarlett O'Hara became a national obsession. After interviewing 1,400 actresses, including Katharine Hepburn and Joan Crawford, they discovered Vivien Leigh, a virtually unknown British actress. The production burned through 3 directors and 6 cinematographers. When adjusted for inflation, no film has come close to matching its box office dominance. Even Avatar and Avengers: Endgame bow before this Southern belle. Director Victor Fleming collapsed from exhaustion during filming and had to be replaced, yet somehow returned to finish the project. The Atlanta fire sequence required burning real movie sets from previous films, creating a blaze so massive that local fire departments received emergency calls from miles away. Critics called it achingly beautiful and revolutionary in scope, while modern historians criticize its problematic portrayal of slavery. The film swept the Academy Awards, claiming 8 Oscars including Best Picture, cementing its legacy as the template every epic romance has tried to duplicate. When Rhett Butler said, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," audiences clearly disagreed. They gave many damns indeed, so many that the film was still playing in theaters when World War II ended 6 years later. 2. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1937. Hollywood laughed when Walt Disney mortgaged his house and bet everything on a feature-length cartoon. They called it Disney's Folly. Until Snow White shattered expectations, earning over $185 million. The first full-length animated feature in history didn't just succeed, it revolutionized what cinema could achieve. Industry veterans predicted audiences would walk out after 10 minutes, claiming no one would sit through a cartoon longer than a Mickey Mouse short. Disney drove his animators to mental exhaustion, demanding perfection in every frame. When banks refused additional funding midway through production, Walt showed them rough footage of the unfinished film. They were so impressed they immediately wrote him a check. The animation techniques invented for Snow White became industry standards overnight. Disney artists secretly filmed live actors performing scenes to study realistic movement, including a young dancer named Marge Champion who served as the model for Snow White. The multi-plane camera created for the film's forest scenes cost more than most entire movies of the era. Critics were stunned by its emotional depth. The New York Times declared it a genuine work of art worthy to be ranked with the best of Walt Disney. The Evil Queen's transformation scene terrified test audiences so severely that dozens of children ran screaming from the theater, forcing Disney to tone down the original version. The film's success was so massive that its merchandising revenue alone could have funded 3 more feature films. Harvard University granted Walt an honorary degree specifically because of Snow White's cultural significance. Walt used the profits to build his studio's legendary Burbank headquarters, which still stands today. Every animated film you've ever loved exists because this gamble paid off spectacularly, transforming animation from novelty shorts to respected cinematic art form. 3. The Ten Commandments, 1956. Cecil B. DeMille didn't just make a biblical epic, he created cinema's most expensive religious experience. The Ten Commandments commanded a then astronomical budget of $13 million and returned $122.7 million, becoming Paramount's highest-grossing film for over 25 years. DeMille, at 75 years old and recovering from a heart attack, insisted on directing from a 70-foot tower in the blazing desert heat. DeMille built the largest set in movie history for the Exodus sequence, a massive ancient Egyptian city constructed in the California desert using 1,000 workers. The structures were so enormous they remained standing for decades afterward, buried in sand until archaeologists actually mistook them for genuine ancient ruins in the 1990s. When Moses parts the Red Sea, you're watching a technological miracle. They filmed water pouring into a giant tank, then played the footage backward. The parting effect used 300,000 gallons of water and created waves 40 feet high. For authenticity, DeMille dispatched teams to Egypt to study historical artifacts and brought back actual desert sand to match colors precisely. Charlton Heston transformed himself physically for the role, fasting to achieve Moses' gaunt, weathered appearance. He spent months growing his beard and hair for the mountain sequences, then had everything shaved and regrown for continuity as filming progressed. The New York Daily News called it the most impressive religious spectacle ever filmed filmed. While the Los Angeles Times praised Heston for his commanding portrayal that transcends mere acting, the plague sequences were so realistic that audience members reportedly fainted during initial screenings. To this day, ABC broadcasts the film annually during Easter or Passover, a television tradition that has lasted over 50 years. When DeMille said, "Give me a camera and enough money and I'll recreate the universe," the Ten Commandments proved he wasn't exaggerating. The film's success was so complete that Paramount executives received unprecedented profit-sharing bonuses, some exceeding their annual salaries. 4. Ben-Hur, 1959. MGM risked everything on what became the most expensive film ever made at the time, $15 million, and won the biggest jackpot in studio history. Ben-Hur chariot raced to $146.9 million worldwide, saving MGM from financial collapse and winning an unprecedented 11 Academy Awards. The studio was so close to bankruptcy that executives joked they were one flop away from becoming a parking lot. The 9-minute chariot race sequence alone took 5 weeks to film, used 15,000 extras, and cost $4 million, more than most entire films of that era. Director William Wyler had an entire second unit working simultaneously just for the race sequence. When a stuntman was nearly killed during filming, star Charlton Heston insisted on doing many of his own stunts afterward to prevent further accidents. Heston spent over 2 months learning to drive the chariot before filming began. Director William Wyler secretly shot 263 miles of footage, enough to make 50 feature films, just to get the perfect angles for key sequences. The sea battle sequence flooded an entire soundstage with over 1 million gallons of water, requiring custom drainage systems to be installed. The chariot sequence was so realistic that urban legends spread claiming stuntmen died during filming. Heston actually did fall from his chariot during one take, narrowly escaping being trampled. They kept the footage and incorporated it into the final sequence. The Hollywood Reporter declared it the greatest achievement in motion picture history, while the Los Angeles Times called it a technical marvel that makes modern CGI look cheap by comparison. Its success was so immense that MGM executives received bonuses exceeding their annual salaries. Adjusted for inflation and considering theater ticket prices, more people saw Ben-Hur in theaters than Avatar or Titanic. The phrase, "bigger than Ben-Hur," entered the lexicon to describe anything of epic proportions. The film's box office receipts literally saved MGM from being sold off in pieces to real estate developers. 5. The Sound of Music, 1965. 20th Century Fox was nearly bankrupt when they gambled on a musical that critics initially dismissed as saccharine nonsense. The Sound of Music defied expectations, earning $158.6 million and single-handedly saving the studio from financial ruin. After the costly disaster of Cleopatra nearly sank Fox 2 years earlier, studio executives jokingly referred to this film as The Sound of Money. Director Robert Wise fought the studio to film on location in Salzburg, Austria, doubling the budget but creating visuals so stunning that tourism to the region increased 700% afterward, an economic impact that continues today. The Sound of Music tour remains Salzburg's most popular tourist attraction 6 decades later. When Julie Andrews twirls on that mountaintop, she's actually being repeatedly slammed to the ground by helicopter downdraft. After multiple takes left her bruised and gasping for breath, they got the iconic shot that opens the film. The helicopter pilot later revealed they completed the sequence just before a massive storm hit the mountain. The film ran for over 4 years in some theaters, with one London cinema showing it continuously for 170 weeks. During this record-breaking run, the theater reportedly had to replace the seats 3 times due to wear. The Wall Street Journal called it the financial phenomenon of the decade, while the New York Times begrudgingly admitted, despite critical reservations, its cultural impact cannot be denied. Christopher Plummer famously hated filming it, referring to it as the sound of mucus behind the scenes, and would get drunk before shooting certain scenes. The soundtrack album alone sold over 20 million copies worldwide, spending 109 weeks on the Billboard charts. Even as musicals fell out of fashion, The Sound of Music remained a financial juggernaut that continues to generate millions annually through TV broadcasts and home media. The film saved Fox so completely that executives canceled planned studio lot sales and instead expanded operations using profits from this single movie. 6. Bambi, 1942. Disney risked financial oblivion on what would become animation's most traumatizing masterpiece. Bambi silently stalked into theaters during World War II, initially underperforming with $3.4 million, but through re-releases eventually accumulated over $267 million, becoming one of Disney's most profitable films. The studio faced potential bankruptcy when wartime restrictions cut off their European market. Animators spent years studying deer movement at the Los Angeles Zoo, even keeping 2 fawns at the studio. The lead animator, Mark Davis, sketched over 400 deer in person before finalizing Bambi's design. The background paintings were revolutionary. Artists developed new techniques to create depth and atmospheric perspective that had never been achieved in animation before. Tyrus Wong, a Chinese-American artist whose impressionistic style defined the film's look, was only credited as a background artist due to studio racism, despite essentially designing the film's entire visual identity. When that infamous hunting scene shocked audiences, Walt Disney received angry letters from parents whose children experienced nightmares. His response? It had to be done. He refused to cut the scene, despite distributor pressure. The New York Times called it a genuine art form that makes other animated films look cheap by comparison. Walt reportedly said that the film's financially disappointing initial release taught me never to rely on quality alone. The original ending was significantly darker, showing the forest completely devastated by the fire, but was changed after test audiences left theaters in tears. The phrase, Bambi's mother, became cultural shorthand for childhood trauma decades before internet memes existed. Even the U.S. Forest Service credited the film with reducing forest fires, as a generation of children feared becoming Bambi burners. Maine hunting license applications dropped 80% the year after its release, leading several states to lobby for the film to be banned. Hunting organizations still refer to the Bambi effect when discussing public opposition to hunting. In a strange twist, Bambi became hugely profitable during the baby boomer generation's childhoods, with re-releases in the 1950s and 1960s earning far more than the original run. 7. Cinderella, 1950. Disney Studios was on the verge of bankruptcy when they bet their last dollars on a fairy tale adaptation. Cinderella transformed Disney's fortunes overnight, earning $85 million and launching the company's modern empire that would eventually swallow Fox, Marvel, and Star Wars. The studio was $4 million in debt and had no hits since before World War II. Walt mortgaged his own home and liquidated company assets to finance the film. Studio electricity was frequently cut off during production due to unpaid bills. Animators sometimes worked by candlelight to finish sequences. For authenticity, actress Helene Stanley performed the entire film in live action first, with animators studying her movements frame by frame. This technique, known as rotoscoping, saved money while achieving fluid character movement, though Stanley was never credited for her contributions. The fairy godmother transformation sequence required 6 months of work by 24 animators working around the clock. The Chicago Tribune hailed it as the savior of American animation, while Walt himself later admitted, without Cinderella, there would be no Disneyland. The glass slipper sequence alone took 6 months to animate. When adjusted for inflation, Cinderella remains Disney's most profitable princess film. Its merchandise sales exceeded $400 million in the first year alone. In 1950s dollars, the film's success was so crucial that a private screening was arranged for Bank of America executives who had threatened to foreclose on Disney's loans. After seeing the unfinished film, they immediately extended the studio's credit line. After its success, banks that had previously refused to lend Disney money now competed for his business. The phrase, Disney Renaissance, actually applies twice in company history, once after Snow White and again after Cinderella rescued the studio from near certain doom. Walt specifically used Cinderella profits to fund his secret Project X, which would later be revealed as Disneyland. 8. The Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957, Colombia. Pictures gambled on a war film that didn't glorify combat and ended up with an unexpected phenomenon. The Bridge on the River Kwai marched to $27.2 million domestically, despite being filmed entirely in Ceylon with a mostly British cast. Studio executives initially rejected the project 3 times as too British for American audiences. Director David Lean battled malaria, leeches, and governmental corruption to complete filming. The production lost 3 weeks when Lean fell ill with tropical disease. The famous bridge was actually built full-scale by the production team, using the same techniques as the World War II prisoners they portrayed, then spectacularly destroyed in a sequence that cost nearly a quarter of the film's entire budget. The real explosion was so massive it had to be filmed with 7 cameras simultaneously, as they would only get one chance. Lean himself operated one of the cameras. The production nearly ended when star Alec Guinness threatened to quit after Lean demanded 70 takes of a single scene. The 2 men didn't speak to each other off-set for the remainder of filming. The New York Herald Tribune called it the finest war film ever made, while the Los Angeles Times praised its refusal to resort to typical Hollywood heroics. Its iconic whistling theme, Colonel Bogey March, became a worldwide hit, despite the original lyrics being too vulgar to record. British soldiers had originally sung obscene lyrics about Hitler's anatomy to the tune. When adjusted for inflation and ticket prices, more Americans saw River Kwai in theaters than watched Titanic. Studio head Harry Cohn, who initially resisted making the film, died just after its massive success. His last words reportedly were, "Thank God I lived long enough to see Kwai make all that money." The film's profits were so substantial that Columbia Pictures established its first international production division using Kwai revenues, fundamentally changing the studio's business model forever. 9. Quo Vadis, 1951. MGM gambled $7.6 million on a Roman epic when the average film cost under $1 million. Quo Vadis conquered the box office with $24 million domestic, becoming the most financially successful ancient Rome film until Ben-Hur. The studio's head of production reportedly told the board, "Either this picture makes us or breaks us." The production employed over 30,000 Italian extras, so many that Rome experienced a temporary labor shortage in other industries. When filming the Colosseum scenes, catering had to feed 10,000 people daily. Director Mervyn LeRoy insisted on authenticity, hiring historians to verify costume designs and Latin pronunciations. For Nero's burning of Rome sequence, they constructed a 200-foot-tall section of ancient Rome on the backlot, then actually set it ablaze in what was then the largest controlled fire in film history. The Italian government nearly shut down production when they discovered the massive pyrotechnics planned. Fire departments from 3 surrounding towns were on standby during filming. The Hollywood Reporter praised its razor-sharp historical accuracy, while the New York Times called Peter Ustinov's portrayal of Nero the definitive screen villain of the decade. Ustinov reportedly stayed in character between takes, terrorizing the crew with impromptu violin performances. The film's success established the template for the biblical epic craze that dominated 1950s Hollywood. It was the first major Hollywood production to film entirely in Italy after World War II, effectively establishing Rome's Cinecittà as a viable alternative to Hollywood studios. When adjusted for ticket price inflation, Quo Vadis outperformed modern hits like The Dark Knight and Jurassic World. Studio head Louis B. Mayer, who initially opposed the project as too expensive, was forced out of MGM shortly after its release, partially because he had fought against what became one of the studio's biggest hits. The film's success convinced every major studio to develop their own biblical epics, leading directly to The Robe, The Ten Commandments, and Ben-Hur. 10. Duel in the Sun, 1946. Producer David O. Selznick tried to outdo his own Gone with the Wind and nearly destroyed himself in the process. Duel in the Sun blasted to $20 million domestic, $266 million adjusted, despite being denounced by the Catholic Legion of Decency and banned in several states. Selznick explicitly marketed it as the picture that makes Gone with the Wind look like a trailer. Production costs spiraled from $2 million to over $6 million, making it temporarily the most expensive film ever made. Selznick's obsession led him to hire and fire 4 different directors, including King Vidor, who eventually received sole credit but only directed about 30% of the final film. Jennifer Jones underwent painful skin-darkening procedures daily to play her half-Native American character Pearl, a process that left her with chemical burns. Selznick, obsessed with Jones both professionally and romantically, demanded over 85 retakes of her love scenes, driving the male leads to complain to the studio. For the climactic shootout, Jones and co-star Gregory Peck spent 3 weeks crawling through actual desert terrain, suffering heat exhaustion and dehydration. The production used so much Technicolor film stock that it caused a temporary shortage for other Hollywood productions. Critics savaged it as filmmaking run amok and a perverted western, while audiences flocked to it in record numbers. The Los Angeles Times famously nicknamed it Lust in the Dust. Time magazine called it a Hollywood film so bad it must be seen to be believed. The film was so controversial that some theaters required viewers to sign statements confirming they were over 18. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it as morally objectionable, prompting Selznick to create at least 5 different cuts across various markets. The most explicit version, shown in major cities, differed significantly from the heavily edited Heartland version. The production's financial excess contributed to the eventual collapse of Selznick International Pictures. Despite its commercial success, the film's enormous budget meant profit margins were slim. Selznick himself later admitted, "I tried to make something bigger than Gone with the Wind and nearly went bankrupt proving it couldn't be done." His company folded within 2 years despite the film's box office success. 11. This is the Army, 1943. Warner Brothers created Hollywood's most patriotic cash machine with a musical that featured actual U.S. soldiers in the cast. This is the Army marched to $19.5 million, $290 million adjusted, with every penny of the studio's profits donated to Army emergency relief. the largest single donation to the military from any source during World War II. When adjusted for inflation, the contribution would exceed $60 million today. The production received unprecedented government support. Over 300 actual soldiers were temporarily reassigned to Warner Brothers for filming. The War Department considered the film so important to morale that they classified it as an official military project. Irving Berlin insisted on performing in the film himself, reprising his World War I song, "Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning," while wearing his old 1918 uniform. At 55, he had to dye his hair to match his appearance from 25 years earlier. The film's integrated cast featured one of the earliest respectful portrayals of black soldiers in Hollywood, though still reflecting the segregation of the actual military at that time. Berlin fought studio executives to keep these sequences intact when Southern distributors threatened boycotts. For authenticity, director Michael Curtis brought in Army drill instructors who ran the cast through actual basic training exercises. Several actors were hospitalized with exhaustion. The New York Times called it the most important film of the war effort, while President Roosevelt attended the premiere and declared it essential for national morale. When the premiere ended, the entire audience spontaneously stood and sang the national anthem. The film toured globally, screening for troops on the front lines with mobile projection units, sometimes within earshot of actual combat. One famous screening occurred just hours after the liberation of Paris, with soldiers watching while still in combat gear. When adjusted for ticket prices and inflation, it outperformed The Dark Knight Rises and Iron Man 3. Ronald Reagan, who appears in the film as a young lieutenant, later cited it as his proudest Hollywood achievement, ranking it above his work as Screen Actors Guild president. The film's financial success inspired a wave of patriotic musicals, though none matched its authentic military involvement or box office performance. 12. Fantasia, 1940. Disney created the world's first surround sound cinematic experience and nearly bankrupted himself in the process. Fantasia eventually accumulated $76.4 million, $83 million adjusted, through multiple re-releases, though initially lost money due to its revolutionary but expensive Fantasound audio system. Disney called it the concert feature and insisted it would transform animation into high art. Disney spent over $2.2 million on what was essentially a feature-length experimental art film. In the middle of the Depression, this was triple the budget of Snow White and considered financial madness by industry standards. The Fantasound system required theaters to install 30 to 54 special speakers at great expense, limiting initial release to just 14 venues nationwide. These installations cost theaters about $30,000 each, equivalent to roughly $550,000 today. Conductor Leopold Stokowski spent over 6 months recording the Philadelphia Orchestra specifically for the film, creating the first multi-channel film soundtrack in history. The recording sessions used groundbreaking technology with 8 separate audio channels and custom-built equipment. Animators studied microscopic footage of crystallizing chemicals to create the abstract imagery for Beethoven's Symphony No. 6 inches. For the Dance of the Hours sequence featuring ballet dancing hippos, professional dancers performed in slow motion for animators to study weight distribution. New York critics were divided, some calling it revolutionary genius, while others dismissed it as Disney's ego trip. The New Yorkers sniffed that it was a form of entertainment which lifts the Disney product from the class of the comic strip to the realm of high art is dangerous. Walt famously responded, "We were just trying something different." The Night on Bald Mountain sequence featuring the demon Chernabog was so disturbing that many theaters refused to show the film. Parents complained that children had nightmares for weeks afterward. During World War II, the Army requisitioned Disney's multi-channel sound equipment for radar systems, effectively killing Fantasound technology for decades. The film was so ahead of its time that it became a cult hit during the 1960s psychedelic culture, with midnight showings becoming popular among hippies who appreciated its trippy imagery. Walt's brother Roy reportedly begged him to abandon the project halfway through, calculating it could never recoup its investment. Disney once said, "Fantasia is and always will be a financial disappointment that proved I was right." He maintained until his death that it was his greatest artistic achievement despite its initial commercial failure. 13. From Here to Eternity, 1953. Columbia Pictures nearly shelved this military drama when the Department of Defense demanded 50-plus script changes. From Here to Eternity defied all expectations, earning $30.5 million and sweeping the Academy Awards with 8 wins. The studio head reportedly told the producer, "If you make this film, your career in Hollywood is finished." Director Fred Zinnemann fought the studio, to cast Frank Sinatra, whose career was in free fall. Sinatra worked for $8,000 instead of his usual $150,000 fee, then won an Oscar that revitalized his entire career. This casting decision later inspired the famous horsehead scene in The Godfather, based on rumors that Sinatra got the role through mob connections. The famous beach love scene between Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr was initially deemed too explicit by censors. They compromised by filming in the surf so water would partially obscure their bodies. What audiences saw was actually tame compared to what was filmed. Several more explicit takes exist that weren't used. Kerr later revealed that the scene was so uncomfortable that both actors were black and blue from the sand and waves afterward. The military initially refused cooperation, forcing filmmakers to shoot around Pearl Harbor rather than on the actual base. The Army objected to the portrayal of enlisted men fighting officers and the corruption depicted in its ranks. The New York Times called it a cinematic hurricane of emotion, while the Los Angeles Times praised its uncompromising look at military culture. The film's success changed Hollywood's approach to on-screen passion. The Production Code Administration received so many complaints about allowing the beach scene that they released a statement defending it as essential to the story. The scene became so iconic that the beach where it was filmed is now marked with a plaque and remains a tourist destination. When adjusted for ticket prices, more Americans saw From Here to Eternity in theaters than saw The Force Awakens. Military recruitment actually increased after its release, despite its unflattering portrayal of pre-war Army life. The Army later used the film in leadership training as an example of how not to manage soldiers, while simultaneously acknowledging its artistic merit with screenings at West Point. 14. South Pacific, 1958. 20th Century Fox gambled on filming the entire production on actual Pacific Islands, doubling the budget, but creating box office magic. South Pacific sailed to $36.8 million domestic, becoming the highest-grossing musical until The Sound of Music. Producers initially balked at the $6 million budget until Rodgers and Hammerstein offered to invest their own money. Director Joshua Logan insisted on shooting in Kwai, Hawaii, despite studio concerns about tropical storms. His gamble paid off visually, but nearly sank the production when Hurricane Nina hit during filming, destroying sets and equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The controversial song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, explicitly condemning racism, caused Southern theater owners to threaten a boycott. The studio stood firm, with producer Buddy Adler stating, "This message is why we made the film." Author James Meigner, who wrote the original novel, later called this the bravest statement in a Hollywood film of that era. For the famous Bali Ha'i sequence, Logan used color filters that bathed entire scenes in pink, green, or blue tints, a technique film critics hated but audiences loved. Logan claimed he was trying to recreate how emotions color our perceptions. The New York Times complained about bizarre color experiments, while Variety praised its commercial courage in addressing prejudice. When star Rossano Brazzi's singing voice was deemed inadequate, the studio secretly dubbed all his songs without telling him until after filming wrapped. The film played for an unprecedented 31 consecutive months at London's Dominion Theatre. The original negative deteriorated from making so many prints to satisfy demand. Adjusted for inflation and ticket prices, more people saw South Pacific in theaters than saw Avatar. Despite massive box office, the film's enormous budget meant it barely broke even on initial release, only becoming highly profitable through soundtrack sales and re-releases. The soundtrack album sold over 7 million copies, spending 3 years on the Billboard charts, longer than any album before it. The film's success reignited the Hollywood musical craze just as studios feared the genre was dying. 15. Around the World in 80 Days, 1956, producer Mike Todd invented the modern blockbuster marketing playbook. With a film so expensive it required creating an entirely new widescreen format, Around the World in 80 Days circumnavigated the box office with $42 million worldwide, revolutionizing how big-budget spectacles were promoted and distributed. Todd famously declared, "I'm not interested in making movies, I'm interested in making smashes." Todd filmed in 13 countries with 68,894 extras and featured 46 celebrity cameos, pioneering the spot the star marketing that Marvel would perfect decades later. He invented the concept of the cameo appearance. With this film, the production traveled over 4 million miles, equivalent to 160 actual trips around the Earth. For authenticity, Todd chartered the same Spanish bull ring used in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, filling it with 10,000 extras for a single scene. When local authorities tried to charge him extra fees mid-filming, he threatened to expose corruption in the local government. The fees were immediately waived. The famous hot air balloon sequence never happens in Jules Verne's original novel. Todd added it because every circus needs a poster image. image. That marketing image became so iconic that many people mistakenly believe it's part of the original story. Variety called it a revolution in film marketing, noting Todd's unprecedented publicity stunts, including around-the-world press junkets for critics. Todd rented theaters outright rather than sharing profits, a distribution model studios still use for major releases. This roadshow approach included intermissions, souvenir programs, and premium pricing, creating the template for how blockbusters would be marketed for the next 50 years. The premiere featured mechanical elephants, global cuisine stations, and performers from 5 continents, costing over $100,000 in 1956 dollars. Todd sent personal invitations to 18,000 people, and Time magazine called it the greatest premiere in Broadway history. When accepting the Best Picture Oscar, Todd famously quipped, "We're all alike, just a bunch of refugees from television." The film played continuously in some theaters for over 2 years, with premium reserved seating and souvenir programs. The first film marketed as an event rather than just a movie, Todd's marketing innovations were so successful that every major studio hired Todd specialists to replicate his techniques for their own blockbusters throughout the next decade. Which of these classics surprised you most? Did your grandparents tell you about seeing any of these in theaters when they first released? Were you shocked to discover how many modern Hollywood tactics were actually invented 70 plus years ago? Drop your thoughts in the comments and ask yourself this. In an age where streaming platforms measure success by engagement metrics rather than ticket sales, could these Golden Age titans have succeeded without the communal theater experience that made them cultural events? Or has Hollywood permanently lost the magic formula these films perfected?